making any kind of connection with humanity. And that is that God likes to come unannounced. Now, in our kind of modern times and modern age, there's probably nothing worse than when you hear the doorbell ring and you are not expecting anyone. Now, we imagine and we hope that it is going to be Amazon and they are going to quickly leave. We wonder if someone sent us a package. Just yesterday, I was sitting on the couch and I was working and the kids were reading, and all of a sudden the doorbell rang and I totally ignored it. It didn't even cross my mind to get up and check. And then about 2 minutes later, it rang again and people were like banging on the door, and I was like, oh, I wonder if there's actually something. Do you know what it was? Any guesses? Girl Guides. So no cookies for us, but unannounced is probably our least favorite way of connecting. I want you to think about any of the stories that you have heard, perhaps from your Sunday school days. Abraham is minding his business, and God shows up and tells him, move. Mary is simply enjoying her pre-married life, and then God shows up, and now she's pregnant. David is hanging out with sheep, and then suddenly he's told, you are going to be king. Paul is on his way to Damascus, and then God shows up, and suddenly he is blind and being prepared to be an apostle. Those stories arise frequently, and it cultivates an idea that even I have adopted as my own about the way that God operates in the world. And that is that God just shows up unannounced all of the time. But we are Wesleyans, and we put a high value on this idea that God is at work in the world, whether one believes it or not, whether one acknowledges it or not, whether it seems plausible or not. Think about where we started last week in the book of Exodus, where we were introduced to Moses. But prior to being introduced to Moses, you get to meet two midwives, his mother, his sister, and later the daughter of the Pharaoh. And all of them seem to be following the move and will of God at work in the world as they respond to the invitation that each of us get to respond to, which is this: will you be a co-creator? Will you be a co-conspirator, a participant in the renewal of all things? Now, we often see that as kind of a more modern invitation, and if not modern, at least something that's connected with the birth of Jesus. But what if the narrative of Scripture points us to the piece of wisdom throughout the text? That in actuality, God has always been interested in everyday people participating in the goodness, love, and flourishing of other everyday people, neighbors and friends, strangers and enemies. So when we free Scripture from being a guidebook on how to reach heaven and allow it instead to be that which offers wisdom, we get to uncover stories and written accounts and observations and theories of those who came to understand that the moment we notice God is not the moment that we meet God. God is less one who shows up unannounced, and we are more so those who take a really long time to notice the God who is. The one who announces, I am who I am. Today, we read about Moses. And we read about that day that Moses notices the God who was always there. For Moses, that moment is when he is in the wilderness. And Moses joins the company of those like Jacob and John the Baptist and Elijah, and even the Ethiopian eunuch who notice God in those kind of barren places. For Moses, this is a moment that is literal and figurative, As Moses had to leave behind his home, he had to leave behind the people who raised him, the people who gave life to him. And when that inner stirring for justice came over him, he became consumed with outrage, and it led to murder. The right intention, the wrong action. And so as Moses wrestles with his identity, with his grave unkindness, his capacity to take life, and the dichotomy of class between the Egyptians and the Hebrews, it pushes him to the wilderness. But even here, in the wilderness, in the dark, in the barren places, God is present. And it's in the wilderness that Moses finds new life. He gets married, he has a child, and he has effectively put aside the problem and the confusion and the concerns of Egypt. That is, until Moses takes notice of God. This time it's in the form of a bush or a tree that is on fire, but the tree is not being consumed. And you can imagine that already it is a little bit alarming that something is on fire, and then even more so when you see that it's not burning. Now, there are all kinds of assumptions and theories around this non-burning bush or tree, but many see it as a moment connected with symbolism, with foreshadowing, with imagery that makes sense in the language and context of the time. In other words, lots of ideas, nothing definitive. So while we might wish that there was some kind of clear answer or explanation, we are simply left with theories and a story. So we don't want to get too stuck here in the burning bush picture because it is a little bit of a challenging text. But what we do want is we want to acknowledge the challenge. We want to say, yeah, it's a little confusing when we think about our modern world and the supernatural of it all. And then we want to look for the wisdom. So Moses takes notice of God as he sees a bush that is on fire but is not being consumed. And it's here that Moses encounters God and is reminded about where he came from. As God says, I have seen Israel. I have heard Israel. I am aware of what it is that they face and what it is that they have endured. And I want you to be the one to lead these people out of Egypt. I want you to participate in their liberation. I want you to go and reveal that the God who saw them is the God who sees them. Yay. Now you might imagine that this is compelling and exciting. After all, a tree is talking to him and he assumes that this is God and that Moses should just see this moment and be like, I have just seen something that no one has ever seen. I have just heard something that no one has ever heard. And I was told that this is holy ground, so I will definitely say yes. But Moses thinks differently. Moses doesn't say yes. Moses is not at all compelled by the fact that this supernatural thing is happening right in front of him. He is not somehow moved because the tree is speaking. He doesn't say, yes, I will go. Instead, he says, who am I to go? Who will I tell them has sent me? Will they believe me? I'm not actually very good with words. Just send someone else. And I'm reminded that regardless of the circumstances and moments or instances that cause us to take notice of the God who is already present, whether for the first time or the 100th time, we are offered a troublesome invitation to participate in what God is doing and where God is moving, even when we may consider ourselves to be the most underqualified candidate. And frankly, God may agree with our assessment of ourselves, that indeed we are underqualified, that indeed we do not have the right skill set, the right gifting, the right temperament. There is the creator and the sustainer of life, who in those moments reminds us that our qualification, our training, our skills, our temperament, our capacity, and our ability are not the point. When Moses says, "Who am I to go? Who am I to be sent to participate in this liberation mission?" the response is this: "I will be with you." When Moses says, "Well, who will I tell them has sent me?" the response from God is, "Will you tell them that I am has sent you?" Which is later clarified as the Lord that was with Abraham, the God that was with Isaac and with Jacob, is now with me, and they are the one who has sent me. When he wonders if they will believe him, God says, "Well, try this," and he asks Moses to participate in an object lesson. One is he takes a stick, and he says, "I want you to throw that stick on the ground," and the stick turns into a snake. He picks it up, it turns back into a stick. You'll see just some connection to that later on as we go through Exodus. And then the other one is he says, "I want you to take your hand and I want you to put it into your cloak." And when he takes it out, his hand is bright like snow, reminiscent of some kind of illness or disease. And then he puts it back in and it turns to its normal condition. And God says, "Well, if you show them these two signs, they are going to believe that it's I who have sent you." And then Moses is like, "I don't think you understand what I am saying." It's like, really, I don't want to go. And so Moses says, "Well, I'm actually not very good with words. I'm not really good at this." And then God says, "Well, I made you. I know how the mouth works, and I will tell you what to do." And then Moses says what he wanted to say all along: "Just send someone else." And the response from God is, "Go, and your brother will speak on your behalf." Now, whether God said those exact words in that exact way or not, the author wants it to be understood that while God did not choose the most qualified, while God did not choose the most appropriate or the most predictable, the significance of Moses being invited to participate in what God is doing is less about who Moses is and more so about who Moses will be when his inadequacies, his easy-to-miss qualifications, and his insistence that there must be someone better are then joined with the God who promises to be with him. You see, on his own, the stick, it just is a stick. On his own, the public speaking is unconvincing. On his own, it makes no sense to go back to a place and to tell an entire group of people that their liberation is just ahead of them when all that they see around them is oppression. It makes no sense to get people's hopes up. It makes no sense to announce anything with any kind of confidence, such as to say, "Let my people go." It's a great story that we can only hope has no bearing on how we live in our context, in our day, and in our time. We really do like these Old Testament stories, but we kind of think that they really shouldn't speak any kind of wisdom to us. But hidden within this text is this word that suddenly shows up: Levi. And we're introduced to this idea that Moses is from the lineage of Levi, which is the priestly line. And the function of the priest is to be a conduit between God and the people. And it's here that some may suggest that Moses is a foreshadowing of the Christ. And in the simplest of terms, we can see it like this. God comes as the Christ, and the Christ, who is Jesus, communicates what God is like to the people. Kind of like a mediator, someone in the middle. In this scenario, God sends Moses, and Moses becomes like God to the people, a mediator of sorts, somehow in the middle. To hear the prophet, to hear Moses, is to hear God. Moses is a conduit between God and the people. Yet, you may still wonder, what does that have to do with me? I want you to fast forward to the book of Acts, when Jesus is about to ascend to heaven, and he tells his disciples this. He says, "You will be my witnesses. You will help those around you to take notice of the God who is already there as you retell my message and my story." And where Christ revealed what God was like to the disciples and the crowds, those who have identified as followers of Jesus' ways will do the same, because this becomes the mission of the church. But even the early church wondered if Jesus was serious about all that he said, or if it was more so something that was just for the apostles, that was just for the first believers, that was just for those who were the early adopters. And so decades later, Peter, in the book that he authors, he writes this to the church. He says, actually, this whole idea of the tribe of Levi, this picture of the priestly lineage that is the priest, God speaks through the priest to the people, that is now extended to you. That is now extended to all of us. To anyone who has taken notice of the God who is always there and have chosen to follow in the way of Jesus, Peter says, you are now the ones called the priests. Not just this person who stands at the front of the church, not just the loudest voices such as my own or the most charismatic of speakers. No, this priesthood thing is now how all those who choose the way of Jesus can now be identified. So those who choose to consider the least of these, those who identify with this radical idea that even strangers and enemies can be neighbors, those who face great violence and injustice yet offer forgiveness, those who make space at their tables for the curious and the doubters, the sinners and the saints, those who have decided that religion is insufficient and doctrine is not enough, all those who follow the way and the message and the love of Jesus, these ones are called priests. And he is immediately clear as to what this means. He says, you will be the ones who show others the goodness of God. You will be the ones who help those around you decipher what God is like. You will be the ones that bring clarity to what it means to follow the way of Jesus. You will be the ones who act as conduits between God and those to whom you are called. And the message is clear. God sees you. God hears you. God is aware of where you find yourself. And this God is not content with the injustice that you see or participate in. This God is not unmoved by the broken edges, the deep sadness, the unkindness, and the inequity that we so easily suggest is nothing more than everyday life. No, this God, the one who sees you, the one who understands what surrounds you, has called me and has invited you and has asked us to participate in ways of being that bring about transformation, that remind us of great hope, that deny the power of great evil, and calls us to come alive as ones who participate in all things being made as God intended from the beginning. Priests, conduits between God and the worlds around us, mediators, ones who show others the goodness of God. Now, this is supposed to be good news. But is it? Is it good news that God has asked us to be the ones who are the conduit between God and others? Do we consider it good news that God has given us this great message of liberation to speak to a world that when they look around them, what they continue to see is the opposite? Is this good news? Or is it simply intimidating and terrifying and overwhelming? That even me, we're invited to be like Moses. In our context, in our situations, in our day, and in our time. And so for all of the reasons that Moses was terrified, and all of the reasons that Moses was uncertain and even unwilling, so are we. We are the ones who ask the exact same questions that Moses did. We are the ones who present the same protests that Moses did. We too are inclined to refuse the invitation that is offered when we take notice of the God who has always been there. Who am I to go? Who am I to speak, to act, to respond? Who will I tell them has sent me and led me and asked me to be present in this situation? Why should they believe me? Why should they believe us? Our skills and our passions, our gifts and our qualifications, they just don't seem to match up with what it is that God is asking. So just send someone else. But just like Moses, when we take notice of God and what it is that God is up to in the world, and see where we can participate in the flourishing, blessing, and renewal of all things, where it is that God has called us and invited us to be as God to the people, to bring attention to the God who sees and hears and is present. It is less about who we are in the moment and more so about who we will become when our lives and our position, our moments, our lack, our misplaced skills, ideas, and qualifications intersect with a God who says, I will go with you. And so for those who are the priests among us, those that Peter says are to show the goodness of God to others, when you take notice of God, when you understand what God is doing or where God is leading, do not be afraid to have that conversation. Be prepared to ask those questions and to remind God about all of the reasons that you are inadequate, all of the reasons you are insufficient, unskilled, and underqualified, and even unwilling. And then I want you to listen. I want you to listen for the ways that God is going to comfort you and remind you time and time again this truth. I know you. I have been with you, and I will be with you. I know you. I have been with you, and I will be with you. I will be with you. Where do you notice God at work? What do you see around you? Whether on a large or small scale, in the classroom, in the office, in your home, or even within yourself. To whom is God leading you? To where is God moving you? In what ways are you inadequate? And I want you to realize that it is right there. It is right there where we are not enough, where we are tired and anxious and afraid, where our energy is insufficient, where our capacity is too small, where our past is too large and our hearts are too hard and the space we are in is too broken. It is right there that we are invited to take notice of the God who has always been present and who promises, I will go with you. And sometimes that listening is going to be in the wilderness. And it's going to seem as though God is absent and silent, but even there we are invited to pause and to listen, because sometimes, as we will see as we go through the book of Exodus, it takes the wilderness for us to take notice of the God who has always been present. This morning, we get to participate in the observance of baptism, where we have these two young women who get to demonstrate in this kind of symbolic, or I don't know the right word, this means of grace that demonstrates that they have died to something and they've come alive to something else. And so even for the two of them, even at their young age and at their young moment, I hope that you will take on that posture of listening, and that throughout your journey, you will be reminded of all kinds of ways where Christ leads you, and that the God who has always been present will always, always, always be with you.